Welcome to Common Ground Discourse, everyone. This is episode 8B. As you've heard previously, we have found ourselves lost in another lengthy conversation. So to keep this intro short and sweet, we give you the remainder of our discussion. Getting deeper into this chapter, I think we both noted that good and evil might seem something salient, but the more you read into this chapter, you realize it kind of just branches off into many other conversations, but even to the rabbit hole that you're talking about, you're getting into the field also with moral paradox. There are, even in thinking about right or wrong in the context of an individual, and then you're blowing that up into an overall, you're going to find instances that, like I said, they create that paradox. Back to the text here, on the moral paradox within this chapter. One thing that I felt was interesting is when he goes to explain how morality is shaped by culture. He goes to say, clearly morality shaped by culture norms happens to a great degree. It can be difficult to do what you think is right on your own. And I wanted to insert this here because it's almost brought up in the text as well, that you have a child who is eating meat, but then she starts to contemplate, that this is a fluffy animal, why would we ever kill it to eat it? The parent says, well, why don't you stop? She's like, I can't. If they're going to keep killing them, I have to keep eating them. And so it's interesting on that sense how a culture can shape your morality in that sense, and there's a conflict there. And I'll even bring this up for the few friends that I have that are vegans. This conversation has some substance to it. When you truly think about the suffering of conscious creatures, after all, that's what we're talking about here. That doesn't exclude animals that aren't just us.
Right.
And we have a concern more about the experiences that another ape would suffer as to what an ant would suffer. So clearly, we have concerns more about those who have a greater capacity to experience suffering. And that's where the argument with veganism comes in, is that we know that we are causing suffering to animals, and we've made attempts to create ways of processing our food in a more ethical manner, reducing the unnecessary violence and reducing the unnecessary suffering. But to completely go against that, what our culture is, we have, especially in food, and I mean, that's the business that I'm in. There's so much surrounding the enjoyment of eating meat, and we don't even bat an eye or think about what's actually going on behind the scene. What does it take to get that to our plate? Deterring here, but again, that's a paradox that occurs in culture. Some of our morality is shaped by that. But what are your thoughts on this whole nature versus nurture versus nature? That we have some moralities that shape our culture, and some culture examples that shape our moral outlook.
I mean, being a high school teacher, I come face to face with nurture and nature on a daily basis. And I see more and more that someone is the product of their culture. That we are very much the product of our culture. Whether it's the insular family, whether it's the community, or larger, that we can't help but be the norm of the culture in which we're raised. And when culture has defined that morality as a collective, and it is then passed on and taught to each subsequent generation, that's where we get it. Now, when the individual pushes back, I find fascinating and heartening, because collectively, human beings have shown that the more of us you get together, the more stupid we do. It's what we do.
It's not false.
And the more of us that do it, the more justified we feel we are in doing it. And that's where we have the social injustices that we have.
Yeah.
So you begin to see the pushback of nature against nurture, where we recognize that while society has been teaching this, maybe it's wrong. And when we go into nature against nurture, I think that's where Harris offers a wonderful avenue where we can start looking at the nature of who we are and what makes us well-being, what gives us well-being as conscious creatures.
Sure.
And we can start challenging that that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, there obviously has to be something there, right? I mean, we're looking at a universal perspective. Not that it's completely gone, but I would like to think that in terms of slavery, the fact that the Earth as a sum whole, we have definitely moved away from that.
Right.
So, well, how do we explain that? I mean, is there a science portion to that aspect? That, yes, enslaving other conscious beings equivalent to yourself is wrong. Now, that's not to say that it's gone. It's obviously still around,
Right.
and in a scary degree on the trafficking side, that is a problem that still exists. But to create a framework of what good and evil is in that sense, and the perspective of culture, and how the individuals who recognize that this is a wrong deed should stand up and speak up against it. And going back to our last episode where we talked about Martin Luther King Jr., he was obviously going against what culture had instilled in terms of what was morally acceptable.
Right.
So props on him there, but it kind of makes you wonder, again, how much you think might be right is just predicated on erroneous culture norms. And I think that's where, again, a science of morality could really liberate us from erroneous thinking. Yeah. We can quantify this into conscious experiences at the level of the brain. That's not to say that, if we can map that a few neurons light up in one area and we say, oh, that obviously points to suffering, and if that, an act in a culture is making that region light up, does that necessarily mean that it's bad? Probably not. I mean, I think there's more that goes into analyzing those kind of behaviors and what culture does, but
it offers us a great glimpse.
There's something there, right? Yeah.
And his specific example that he gave with the moral paradox of population ethics,
mm-hmm.
he brought it down to the extreme necessary for the point of argument.
Mm-hmm.
And that what if you have an entire population that's living a fantastic life, and it's based off the slavery of a very select few.
Mm.
And while they live absolutely terrible lives, the vast majority, more so than you would have had before, are now living better lives.
Mm-hmm.
Is it worth it? And hypothetically, from the outside, that looks fantastic. Well, of course, just by sheer arithmetic,
sure,
this seems to be a better society. But he points down at a neurological level that when we intuitively know that when our happiness is based off the suffering of another, then the parts of our brain that light up are not so much the reward receptors, but the degree of pain negotiation, negators, that you're dealing with the negative consequences and trying to mitigate that in your life, not looking at the reward side. So you're even doing subconsciously and neurologically the conscious leap of dealing with someone else's suffering, whether you recognize it or not. At a fundamental scientific level, you are recognizing that something's wrong.
Yeah, and I think that is an aspect that we'll discuss more, especially when we get into the chapter of belief. Mm-hmm. But just to touch upon it really quick here, so that we don't lose that, that our concepts of right or wrong we often see in terms of potential gains and potential losses, and we know that in the brain it lights up in the same area, it just decreases in activity. Right. So when we talk about right and wrong, or what is good and bad in terms of moral choices, we're going to see that what we view as a gain or a loss is going to heavily influence our decisions to make those actions. Right. But yeah, we'll get into that with belief for sure. I know we wanted to get into moral responsibility going into the judicial system.
Right.
So I think when you talk about good and evil, we've constructed a way of living and punishing those who do bad. And this opens a whole new conversation about retributive impulses, restorative justice, and things of that nature. I'd like for you to start the conversation off with that so that we can...
What I find fascinating in this specific section about good and evil when he goes into justice systems is that there is a fundamental divide in theist conversation about what the nature of good and evil is. Where does good and evil come from? A great theological question. And the two sides to this, which aren't often discussed, sadly enough, but are often played out in religion, I think is worth noting. There are two ways to look at where good and evil come from, or what the relationship is between. And historically, at least within Christianity, you have an old form which is a heresy, eventually deemed a heresy, called the Manichaean heresy, that sees a severe dualism between good and evil. That good is that part of God that is great, and then you've got evil, which is that equal and opposing force that is against God. That they are two separate sides, and in order for mankind in creation to finally win out, to finally have good, then good has to completely destroy evil. And we see this embodiment in the images of the devil and demons and that kind of thing, that they're an evil force that is always trying to attack good. So they must be subjugated. They must be condemned, confined in hell, whatever that punishment is. But they are complete and opposite and opposing to God. The other side is this, which we see a lot in Jewish mysticism, but we also see in the roots as we inherited through Christianity, that good is that great quality that is God when things are going as they should. Evil is an aspect of good when good is being overshadowed. It's no longer an opposite force that is destroying good. It is a force that is allowed to exist or comes to fruition when good is diminished. The analogy would be that of a candle and light. If you have a candle in a room, you have light everywhere. Darkness only appears when you cover up the candle. Darkness is not something that itself can come and cover up a candle. It cannot do that. It only happens when that candle is overshadowed. Evil only happens because the good that is in us has been overshadowed. And when you see that aspect of good, that aspect of the divine, that is in every person, then it finally comes down to how do you deal with that evil? What do you do with it? If you follow the Manichaean form, and we see this in our justice system time and time again now, if you follow the Manichaean form, then for good to prevail, you must destroy evil. You have to put the evil person away. It justifies capital or corporal punishment and capital punishment. When you have to kill murderers in order to remove that evil from society. It's the Manichaean view of it. But if you take the other side, then if the person is no longer an evil that has to be destroyed, they are in fact a good that has to be redeemed. That person has the fundamental quality of good that needs to be brought out. They can be a moral person, and it is your moral obligation to reach out to that aspect of divinity or humanity, depending on which side you want to look at, and restore it and redeem it rather than destroy it. Then that is a fundamental shift in how you act morally with other people. And until you really settle on where you think good and evil come from, or what the relationship is between those two forces, all actions that you have hereafter are somewhat groundless and are only done by reflex. And for Harris's point, when he talks about restorative justice, when you have those that are put in to jail, if you realize there is a mental issue, then to like if they murder someone because there's a tumor in their brain that stops them from having that that thought process of empathy or any form of filter, then to withhold surgery or treatment for that individual as part of their punishment now looks cruel, because you realize it's not their fault, it's part of their biology. which then leads to the next question he has, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Mm-hmm. What if we had a cure for evil? If we recognize that our impulses and our actions come down more to biology, especially when he wrestles with free will, and he ultimately decides we don't have free will, which will be a whole other conversation, not here. When he says, if we find a cure for evil, what is the moral obligation about whether or not we actually follow through with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, when I first stumbled across that in the book, and it's a really short paragraph, so I'll recite it now. Consider what would happen if we discovered a cure for human evil. Imagine, for the sake of argument, that every relevant change in the human brain can be made cheaply, painlessly, and safely. The cure for psychopathy can be put directly into the food supply, like vitamin D. Evil is now nothing more than a nutritional deficiency. If you have ever seen the movie Equilibrium, have you seen that? Christian Bale in it. This is exactly what your mind will go to. So just really brief summary. There is a cure for evil. Mm-hmm. It's basically a medication you take every day. It suppresses anger. It basically removes emotions so that you have the ability to just think logically, lead out a very boring life, devoid of any pleasures or stimulus on either side of the spectrum.
Same principle behind The Giver, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Very similar. Yeah. Plot aside, it seems attractive to start off with, but then you're taking away humanity, which is basically the story of Equilibrium. It's like, if you do that, you are destroying most of what we are, and eliminating a lot of conscious experience, which now you're rendering some of the brain useless. And what does that look like? What are the long-term effects of that? Now, it seems attractive. Right. Wouldn't it be great if we could come up with the ultimate creme brulee that could make people just be good forever? And I don't see why that's a bad idea. But when you get into the ethics of distributing something like that, it's a sticky conversation that I personally don't feel qualified to really speak on in depth. All I can say now is that, boy, wouldn't it be great if there could be such a remedy to that. That's not to say that there's not a way that we could help ourselves with that. I mean, obviously, from an atheistic or non-theistic perspective, when we talk about the origins of good and evil and how you conduct good, that to me is really just a problem of whether or not you're developing your skills of empathy or self-awareness or emotional regulation or what have you. I think a lot of that plays into, especially on the empathy side, connecting with one another and being able to have an interest in the goals that other people might have and not just be completely selfish. And I know we could probably elaborate on what it is to be selfish and the human condition to be predisposed to selfish tendencies. And we are mostly concerned with things of our self-interest. There's an example here that he goes on to talk about, that you can be as concerned as you can about the thousands of starving children overseas, but the moment you lose a finger, you will not be able to sleep. Whereas the night before, you were able to sleep as thousands of children were starving. And I know that's all kind of relative, and in some case it does make sense. Ultimately, your brain is connected to your body, and you're going to be concerned more about that, and there are pains that are inflicted upon losing a limb or what have you that the screams of children don't. Now, unless it's in front of you, then you would be concerned, but then only slightly so, to an extent. I wanted to read a little bit, going back to when we were talking about justice and how we treat others. There are two paragraphs. One of them precedes the evil pill. Of course, we hold one another accountable for more than those actions that we consciously plan, because most voluntary behavior comes about without explicit planning. And this goes back to free will, but that's another conversation. But why is the conscious decision to do another person harm particularly blameworthy? Because consciousness is, among other things, the context in which our intentions become completely available to us. What we do subsequent to conscious planning tends to most fully reflect the global properties of our minds, our beliefs, our desires, goals, prejudices, etc. If after weeks of deliberation, library research, and debate with your friends, you still decide to kill the king, well, then killing the king really reflects the sort of person you are. So that's one side, and that goes back to the context of what you're thinking when you go. But if you are completely normal and then just you develop a tumor, for example, and you commit that crime, it makes sense why we would pass justice differently,
right?
And it should. I think that needs to be taken into account as we conduct our justice system, whether it be retributive or restorative, otherwise. The last part that I want to call in here is that we are deeply disposed to perceive people as the authors of their actions, to hold them responsible for the wrongs they do us, and to feel that these debts must be repaid. Often the only compensation that seems appropriate requires that the perpetrator of a crime suffer or forfeit his life. It remains to be seen how the best system of justice would steward these impulses. Clearly, a full account of the causes of human behavior should undermine our natural response to injustice, at least to some degree. It seems doubtful, for instance, that Diamond's father-in-law, and he gives an example earlier about Jared Diamond, would have suffered the same pangs of unrequited vengeance if his family had been trampled by an elephant or laid low by a cholera. Similarly, we can expect that his regret would have been significantly eased if he had learned that his family's killer had lived a flawlessly moral life until a virus began ravaging his medial prefrontal cortex. This goes back to the example that we gave in our previous episode about a person who can conduct his life normally and then just turns into a killer. But I think these are important to think about as we're thinking about context of good and evil, especially with moral responsibility and how we conduct the penalties that we pass on in our justice system. It's not an easy topic to discuss, but I think in a sense we have to be able to examine all of the facts that go into that. And I can feel myself getting onto this wall of wanting to discuss free will right now, so I'll save it, but maybe we can come back to this video and put a link to that, because I happen to be in the same boat with Harris here, and I think I'm predisposed to it because of my fascination with neuroscience, and I think as a consequence of his profession, he has only to see free will for what it is. Essentially, just to sum it up, you've got actions that take place in your mind before you're consciously aware of them, and a lot of the actions that we do, we don't deliberately think about, as we just said. So with that in mind, when you take moral thought, or how people behave in a moral context, if we're not truly governing our actions, we go back to what we were just talking about with moral thought in the first place. You can think about it, but for the most part in how you conduct yourself, whether it be good or evil, is that something that moral thought's going to play a big role into if it's just done occasionally? Wouldn't you have to be a student of morality every day to truly conduct yourself in that way? And I think that goes back to my point of practicing empathy and self-awareness.
It also goes back to the idea of nurture and nature.
Yeah.
That when I look at morality, and it's important for us to conceive this, I think our conversations in the public sphere about morality have somehow skewed the idea that morality and that doing a moral thing is an innate knowledge. That you come out knowing what's right or wrong. I know I shouldn't steal. And the more we go into that, and that morality is something that should be automatic and innate, and the more we move away from the fact that morality must be discussed and has to be taught in culture, we justify ourselves in decrying and abusing others that do not have our moral schema. How can you not? I mean, I think morality, this right or wrong, is automatic and innate. It's obvious to me. You don't know it, so you're defective, when in fact your conclusion of right or wrong itself is a construct just as theirs is. We need to bring morality back to the public sphere as an area of conversation and debate and education, because it's not automatic. I mean, as you bring up empathy, sympathy is automatic. If I see you get kicked in the shin, I know I've been kicked in the shin, and I have sympathetic receptors that pick up on that. However, to be empathetic is to require an effort to go into the emotions that I have felt before and find a way to connect them to emotions that you are feeling now that are in some way similar. But I have to be taught empathy. We have to teach morality. And if morality becomes a teaching, if morality is in fact an academic genre now, like you would teach English, science, and mathematics, then we need to create a better discipline and arena for conversation so that our nature is in fact nurtured from generation to generation by the higher degrees of moral thought that hopefully from generation to generation, as we continue to talk about it, will get better. But that's my conclusions on his good and evil for this one, is that we need to start talking about it and teaching it again.
Sure, and I would have to agree. If you just tuck it away, I mean, you lose what you don't use, right?
Because that way in those innate moments, when you do have that subconscious thought that you're acting without free will, that's conditioning. What we need to do is start conditioning ourselves as we grow up through education and training, so that when the moment does hit, we act morally, not by conscious thought, but because we have been conditioned through prior thought and experience to do the right thing at that time.
Yeah, I have to agree. And I think for at least this chapter, and to not create another A and B episode here, we might be able to wrap it up. So far, what we haven't discussed, and has been in the back of my mind, and I haven't done due diligence, is talking about what would it take to render this fallible. And I think it's important to talk about. We might as well do it now before we get into belief, as we're discussing good and evil. But a falsification of the thesis, and he has several points that he's pointed out in this book, so at least he's cognizant of that. We'll give him that. But maybe we can just use these as statements and discuss a few of them now. One of them is, we have every reason to believe that the pursuit of such goals lead upward on the slope of the moral landscape. The claim that science could have something important to say about values because values relate to facts about the well-being of conscious creatures is an argument made on first principles. It doesn't rest on empirical results. If there is a more important source of value that has nothing to do with the well-being of conscious creatures in this life or the life to come, this thesis would be disproved. What is such a source? If someone claimed to have found it somewhere, it could be of no possible interest to anyone. What are your thoughts on that?
I really don't take issue with that one.
Okay. Yeah. And neither do I. I mean, it's...
he's trying to play argumentatively. He's trying to offer a counterclaim and then come back to his own side. But I think he's on solid ground on that one.
Mm-hmm. If human well-being were completely haphazard, there would be no future for scientific understanding of human values. This would also be unrelated to states of the brain. And he does a really good job, and this is an aside, he does a really good job of bringing everything back to the states of the brain, because it really is what we consciously experience. Everything we experience is just relying on how our brain is operating right now. And if we can't give it to neuroscience to have something to say about the experiences that we have in this world, in reality, and the environment that we're in, if we say that has nothing to do with values, nothing to do with what we can perceive to be good or bad or beneficial to us or detrimental to health, then neuroscience is a useless branch, and therefore the brain is nothing more than insulation for the head.
Right.
I laughed at his description about that, but it's in a sense, if you don't value what neuroscience has to say about what the brain is interpreting as beneficial to itself, then what are we really getting from the findings of neuroscience?
Right.
If some people are made happiest by brain state X while others are made miserable by it, there would be no neural correlate of human well-being. Concordantly, if an individual's well-being internally were completely unrelated to their external surroundings and environment, then the thesis would also be falsified, and we can make no claim on human flourishing in the world.
And I can't think of any instances where that would necessarily be true.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's a fancy way, well, not fancy way, but it's obvious. Another way of putting it is that your brain takes in the information around it.
Right.
That's essentially what that is. True or false? If it were the case that, if it were the case in the previous statement, that is the way how the world actually worked, like I said, the brain would be no more than insulation. Can we say that the field of neuroscience constitutes a very elaborate but most costly method of misunderstanding the world?
I think neuroscience is a very costly and elaborate way of how we experience the world, which is where its greatest gift is. I wouldn't say it's necessarily how we define the world, etc. But I do appreciate, from a reflective point of view, that Harris, as a scientist, is following his own method, and that you have to be critical of yourself. Knowing this is his thesis, I laud the fact that he sets up hypothetical fallacies or falsifications for it. If these are true, then mine cannot be. And what he's offered in these premises, I can't see to debunk what he's offering right now.
Yeah. And he, as a reader, and I appreciate the work that he's done, and I generally appreciate most of the conversations that Sam stimulates in our public discourse. I'd love to see more on this. And I've seen a few, but they're just not interesting. And I think some of them, and I'm ill prepared, I should have had them, but they don't seem to be grasping most of what he's putting into context. It's normally an isolated rebuttal to his argument. So with that being said, I think we can wrap up good and evil. Again, as always, if you enjoyed this, please let us know by liking. We've seen a deficit in comments, so we please encourage you to join the conversation. We did a Q&A in the past. I would love to do more of that, and I'm sure you would as well. We're getting to that point now where we've covered most of the critical topics that we've wanted to cover, and we'll start inviting some guests on, which is going to be really fun. So yes, please subscribe to the channel if you have not already to stay up to date. Like our Facebook page and join the conversation there. And until next time, God's peace.